So tonight I'm going to talk a bit about give you an overview basically of the work I carried out at the Davidson site, which is a late archaic settlement, I'm going to call it, on the Ausable River in southwestern Ontario. This is very much work in progress, so there's many things I still haven't been able to do, and COVID hasn't made it easier to get in the museum and look at the assemblages to do more work. But at the outset, I want to acknowledge a number of individuals who have made this project possible at Davidson. Certainly Kettle and Stony Point First Nation, and particularly Greg George, who was my contact at the First Nation. I also want to thank, of course, the landowners, Rick, and unfortunately she's passed away now, the late Marlene Davidson, who were the best landowners you can have to give access to the property and to help us out in carrying out this project. I also have to mention the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, who were the major funder of the research I'm going to talk about tonight. And then there's a large number of people, many of which I will mention during my talk below, who were co-investigators, provided technical logistic advice and assistance, and so on. So the Davidson is a late archaic site, and I didn't know the background of people and how much they knew about the pre-contact Ontario archaeology, but archaeologists generally recognize three major periods: the Paleo, the earliest, then Archaic, and then the Woodland. The Archaic is the longest. It lasted for about 8,500 years, from about 11,500 to 3,000 years ago. But despite the length of time that it's actually in existence, we really don't know much about it. So that I have called it the black hole of Ontario archaeology. And in fact, this came across to me in a book I edited many years ago on the archaeology of Southern Ontario, where there was a review by the archaeologist Michael Schott in American Antiquity, and he noted that the Archaic period spans 60% by time, but only 13% of the book, because we know so little about it. Now, the question is, why do we know so little about the Archaic? Why is it neglected or unknown? And there's a number of reasons, I think, just some of which I've listed here. One is that these sites are obviously older, so we have lesser preservation. Often all we have is flaking debris and the odd stone tool. Another reason is because it's prior to pottery, there's not as many diagnostics that you can find, say, on a surface site to actually recognize what you're looking at. The main diagnostic we have, of course, is the stone weapon tips, the stone hunting weapon tips, like the one on the left here. And that's about one of the few ways to identify sites. And on many sites, these have been removed by relic hunters over 100 years if they're in plowed fields. So it's hard to date the sites and recognize that they're even archaic sites because of that. Also, we're dealing with a time period when people did not practice agriculture. And the stereotype is they didn't live in settled villages for any length of time. And therefore, the record is dominated by very small sites because people were moving seasonally to different campsites to be where resources were as hunters and gatherers, and that they move their camps often. And archaic sites are often stereotyped as largely small and ephemeral scatters of stone debris. In fact, if you're in CRM, I think you probably think archaic scatters are the most common site you find. And also, I think from a theoretical perspective, archaeologists have neglected, certainly in Ontario, because they've been stereotyped, archaic peoples, as simply egalitarian hunter-gatherers. And they're less important theoretically to many academic archaeologists who are interested in social complexity and origins of agriculture and these sorts of questions. Even the small amount that we know, I want to point out, much of our knowledge is simply expectations. We've been dominated by certain untested theoretical precepts that, change is unidirectional. And for example, that throughout the Archaic, people started out as very, very mobile, moving around the landscape season by season. And they settled down a bit by the late Archaic, but that's really just an expectation from the model, because you'd be hard pressed to actually demonstrate that with evidence. And as this quote indicates here, we've had a lot of theorizing, but it's very hard to evaluate any idea. It may be that people were settling down more in the late Archaic, but if you don't have any data to evaluate that question, then you're in trouble. So I decided that we needed to get some better information on the Archaic if we want to do anything about it, and from well-preserved sites. And by that, I mean that we need to start trying to target sites that have evidence of the preservation of animal bone and plant remains, which are rarely preserved on these sites, as I mentioned earlier, because of their age. I also thought it was good that we start to target sites that are undisturbed by plowing, because these sites that are undisturbed by plowing have a better probability of having preserved cultural features like pits and structure remnants. They basically, with the modern plowing in plowed fields where many sites are, they're plowing so deeply that most of the features would be small and they'd be completely destroyed by plowing. Also, a lot of these sites, as I mentioned, have been collected off of for 100 years in some cases, So much of the material has been removed by collectors and so on. And as a result, we don't really know what they were like to begin with because of that. And since these sites are well preserved and buried are so rare, there's a low probability, I think, of finding these in CRM, which dominates Ontario archaeology today. You can find them, and they have been. I think of the work that Ron Williamson and his company did at the Big Peace Bridge site at Fort Erie. But there's a low probability of finding these sites in CRM. And I figured if we want to find out about the archaic, academic archaeologists get to choose a bit the sites that they would like to work on, and that we might as well focus on the areas where it's unlikely that CRM is going to tell us anything, or at least quickly tell us anything about that. So I decided that I would focus on looking for suitable sites that had the preservation and so on. And my attention focused on the late Archaic, or the last part of this long Archaic period after about 3200 BC. And one of the reasons I focused on this is because, as I say, there's always been the stereotype that people move less often in this time period, that they weren't as mobile as earlier. But as I say, demonstrating that is another thing altogether with actual evidence. Did they move less often? Well, let's actually test that idea with some evidence from sites. Now, in the late Archaic in southwestern Ontario and much of southern Ontario, archaeologists often divided into three groups of sites, what are called narrow point, broad point, and small point, because the weapon tips that are used in those periods are very different. As you can see, I show examples of each at the bottom here on this. And these are the most complex tools in the sense, stone tools, in the sense that they involve a lot of decisions in their manufacture. So they're most distinctive of particular time periods in there. For Davidson, as I'll point out to begin with, there are no narrow points, and the main components are there's both a broad point and a small point, and I'll talk more about what those are in just a minute. Now, the Davidson site, as I say, I wanted to find some sites with preservation, so I decided to look at several late Archaic sites that had this better preservation. And the second site that I investigated, the first one didn't pan out, but the second one I investigated was the Davidson site. And this one, as I say, has both broad point and small point components. It's located, as you can see here, near the southeastern shore of Lake Huron, just inland from there, just south of the modern town of Grand Bend. And it's on the east bank of what's the Ausable River. It's just to the southeast of Kettle Point, which is a location where there's a major source of chert that was used in southern Ontario pre-contact period at that time. I also note the Wyoming moraine, this big glacial moraine here, because the deposits at Davidson and below that, it's rock-free. So any of the big mounts of firecrack rock I'm going to talk about later had to be brought from 10 kilometers to the south from the Wyoming moraine to get to the site itself. Now, as I say, there's two main ones, the broad point and the small point Archaic, and they're the main ones here. And let me just see if I can, somehow my screen has got moved around here on, I can't read it or see it, but anyway, the main points at Davidson are Genesee points. There are several styles of these large stem, wide, broad points. And they date, as I said here, about 2500, 800 BC, based on the few dates we had when I started working at Davidson. The broad points are stylistically, this style of point is found over a wide area, and it's found all over Eastern North America, from down in the southeast in Georgia to the north in Maine and into Southern Ontario. The earliest sites seem to be in the south, in places like sites like Stallings Island, a famous site in Georgia, which I show some picture of some of the artifacts at the right here. So it's very widespread. They begin in the south and it seems to spread north, eventually encompassing Ontario. But the process by which that occurred, the spread of this use of this technology, is not well understood at all. The small point Archaic is after about 1500 BC. And it's called the small point or terminal Archaic because it's the end of the Archaic before the introduction of pottery, as archaeologists see it. That you have a shift from those very large stem points that you had earlier in the broad point to the use of a smaller range of points, and that's why the term small point is used. There's a wide range of styles of points that were used in small point, and all of these occur at Davidson, the three main ones I've shown here. And unlike the earlier broad point, the stylistic ties shift. And so where do you find other sites with these kinds of points? You don't find them to the east and southeast like you saw in the broad point. Rather, they're to the west and Midwest at sites like Durst Rock Shelter in Wisconsin, or the famous Riverton culture of southern Illinois. And I show some of the Riverton points here, which are very much like Crawford Knoll points in Ontario. Now, as I mentioned, there's no narrow point at the Davidson site. And why is that? Well, it's because prior to the Broadpoint times, the site was actually flooded. If you look at the map on the left here at lower left, you see the dotted line Nipissing, and this is a high water level that existed at the time prior to 2700 to 2500 BC, and it flooded all of this area you can see on the lower right here, including the Davidson site itself. And in fact, in the upper picture, we have people surface collecting on the Davidson site, and to the east, you can see the old wave cut shore bluff of the Nipissing phase. And on top of it, there's a giant metal shed and barn there. So you get some idea of how large and well cut it is. But because the site was covered, there could be no narrow point occupations, and broad points would be the first ones at this site after the water drained down after about 2700 to 2500 BC. Now, the site was brought to the attention of archaeologists, although collectors knew about it previously. In 1977, it was discovered by the late Ian Kenyon, who was working for the Ministry of Culture. He was doing a canoe survey looking for sites along the river. And as he told me, he came around this bend in the canoe up here in the upper right here. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but ahead of him, he could see this white exposed bank here. And this was represented in the spring of that year. There'd been a huge erosional event, which he had previously, as you can see in the right picture here, there had been a wooded area all along the side and then back from it, the cultivated field. But what happened is in the spring of 1977, the bank eroded back here and eroded this whole area. It removed all of the wooded area in that vicinity and then back into the plowed field. And Ian could see this eroded bank here. And he pulled the canoe over, and as he explained it to me, he walked up to the bank, and down about a meter, there was an old soil or an old ground surface there, and he reached up and pulled a Broadpoint right out of it at the time. So there was a deeply buried site here along the river. Ian also did other work at the site. At the lower right, there's a diagram. He mapped the different layers that he could see. And essentially what you have here is you have flood deposits on top. And these are all flood deposits as post-contact. They're of European age. What happened when Europeans came in, they started damming the river for sawmills and all of this sort of stuff. And also, of course, they removed all the vegetation cover for agriculture. And this created all sorts of free sediment. And so the river began to flood all the time. And these are all flood deposits that date from on top of the old ground surface as it existed prior to Europeans. So you have this buried layer, buried by recent flood deposits, which was 10 to 15 centimeters thick. Ian reported Broadpoint artifacts. He also reported that there was fauna, and although it wasn't extremely well preserved, it's still some preservation. There's also flora, and also there were features. And in fact, this upper diagram shows the profile that he drew. And it's basically sort of at northwest to southeast, but this is basically at the river. And as you move back here, you get more out into the plowed field behind it. And at the river, this buried layer is about 1 meter deep, but it gradually slopes up, as you can see here, until eventually out in the plowed field, it's incorporated completely in the plow zone. And of course, artifacts get turned up here, but there are no artifacts here because it's too deeply buried for the plow to reach, or it's in that wooded area bordering the river. Ian also found features, and these are the profiles of several of them. And one, he got charcoal organics, so there's floral preservation, and he got a radiocarbon date of about 2400 to 2030 BC, which was in line with other few dates that we had for Broadpoint at that time. He returned to the site the next year because the bank was eroding more, and there he found a whole bunch of other features. He excavated along the edge here in this eroded bank at the bottom on the right map. He also mentioned at this time that there's other material out in the field, although he just said they were in this area that he called Area B, and that there were later materials, and it turns out that those were Smallpoint archaic materials. Now, knowing that this site had a potential for buried deposits and it had some preservation, I visited the site in 2005 with my good colleague and friend, Brian Deller. Brian knew the Davidsons, so could introduce me to them, so they give me permission to go out and look at the site. And Brian and I walked out on the surface, and unlike when Ian looked at it, we saw surface material, lots of material, firecrack rock, thousands of artifacts on the surface, firecrack rock, waste flakes from making stone tools. But what we noticed is as you got closer to the river, there was nothing. They disappeared. And we suspected that it was the same as Ian had found, that farther back in the field, the artifacts are being turned up. But as you move towards the river, it gets more deeply buried, so that there was intact deposits here along the river. So in 2006, we excavated a series of 1 or 1 by 2 meter test units, which I show in the photos at right. And we found exactly what Ian had found. We found that buried under these flood deposits, the AP, B1 and B2, I thank Andrew Stewart who did all the soils descriptions at the site. This is my geoarchaeology type there. And we found this buried layer here, and we found broadpoints in the test units. We found evidence of preservation. Again, not perfect, but here's a tip of a harpoon. And we also found there were features. Here's a giant pit that we went through at one end of one of their 1 by 2 meter units. The only thing that was really different that we found from Ian's is that this black layer, the old ground surface here, was really thick. It wasn't 10 to 15 centimeters. It was very thick. And that's because of all the human activity, which would built up a lot of organic matter here on the surface in this area. So I decided this was a perfect site. I had justification for excavating it and doing work there. And the first thing we did was we've investigated the site in several ways, but obviously we've done a lot of surface survey on the parts that are plowed where artifacts are turned up back from the river. Now, in mapping the surface finds, we've done 14 complete collections of piece plotting the material, but we've only piece plotted and collected the diagnostics or tools from the surface. The reason is there are literally 1 million artifacts on the surface, waste flakes and firecrack rocks, so you could never map everything. To get an idea of the density of material, we did do one complete collection of the southern half of the site, which I show at lower left here, where we gridded the whole area in 5 meter squares and collected everything. And this is the less intensively used part of the site. The north part is where it's really intensively used. And we got 165 kilograms of firecrack rock from that area alone. We ended up with about 7 boxes full of artifactual material, picking up everything off the surface by those units. Now, as I say, we piece plotted the diagnostics. These included the points, of course, Genesee Broadpoint on the surface, a Crawford Knoll Point, Smallpoint here. But we also mapped these flakes on coarser grain rocks, notably what Ian Kenyon and Bill Fox have identified as a coarse grain rock subgraywacke. Now, why did we do that? Well, it's because they're diagnostic of the Broadpoint component. When Ian did work at the site, what he noted was, of course, that the site is close to Kettle Point, where you have cherts, but then there are some Kettle Point chert points on the site, but they tend to be smaller and atypical. And the reason for that is Kettle Point is a good material, but it doesn't occur in the large flaw-free pieces, so you can make these large stem points. As a result, the people making broadpoints at the site relied heavily on imported cherts, notably Onondaga, as in the examples. These are drawings by Ian at the top. But they also relied on coarser grain rocks that are not as easy to flake, but you can still flake them, of which subgraywacke, I show some examples at the bottom, is one example. So the coarser grain rocks, particularly large thinning flakes on these rocks, are just as diagnostic of the Broadpoint component as the tools themselves, the points themselves. So that's why we map them. They're diagnostic. So what did all of that show us? Well, the surface collections plus the testing, my excavations, Ian's, as well as testing in areas like the southern edge of the field, indicates this site is huge. It covers about 1.9 hectares. It certainly doesn't meet the stereotype of archaic sites as small ephemeral lithic scatters, because there's dense amount of debris on the plowed surface, and as we'll see in the excavations. And as I mentioned, we collected everything from the southern half, where we got 165 kilograms of firecrack rock from one collection down there. So there's dense amount of debris. The site is huge, and it's bigger than, most. I can't think of another archaic site that's been reported that's as big as this from Ontario. Now, another way we investigated was using soil probes, using a simple Oakfield soil probe. These take about a 10-inch core that's very small, so it's not doing much damage when you plow it in, but it allows you to get a quick way of seeing what's underneath the plow zone and down in the ground. And so you can tailor your excavation strategy accordingly. And what we found in this transect, we did them at 1 meter intervals in this case, is that here's the plow zone at the top, but underneath it, you still have that buried layer. In other words, even though there's artifacts on the surface, the plow has only dug into the top of that buried layer. So it's still partially intact over this whole area in here, or completely intact as in the excavated area. And I'm guessing about 3,500 meters square is still intact beneath the plow zone in that. So there's a large area that hasn't been really disturbed a lot by plowing. Now, we also investigated using various geophysical survey methods. I'm not going to go into all of them in detail. We use 3 main ones for various reasons: a magnetometer survey or radiometer, a magnetic susceptibility survey, and also we use ground penetrating radar, largely to get at the geological history. I'm only going to focus on the magnetometer here to give you an idea of what it reveals about the site for the sake of brevity. Here we see Ed Eastaugh from the University of Western Ontario, who did the magnetometer survey or gradiometer survey at the site. And what this tool does, it measures the strength and intensity of the magnetic field. And the way it was done here is that Ed walked transects. It took him 84 hours of walking these transects. It takes a reading every meter or so, and then you go and put another meter to the other side of it and do it again. And he managed to do 15,500 a meter square of the site over 84 hours of walking back and forth. And this is the map that's produced, superimposed on a top map of the site right here. I note that there's nothing in this area. It turns out that the river was here at the time of the archaic occupation, and that it's moved to the west where this red arrow is at top here over time. And what you can see on this map is there are all these black speckles and white speckles, and the black speckles are magnetic anomalies or areas with much more intensive magnetic readings than the areas around them. Now, what would that be? Well, one example would be firecrack rock. If you heat rock, the iron in it will become magnetized. So if you've got a pit feature full of firecrack rock and things, it's going to show up as having a higher amount, a stronger and more intense magnetic field. And so what happens, you can see this better on this map. This is what we saw on the left here. You can see the black marks, and there's a dense band of them paralleling where the old river was, and it went down into this area that eroded away where Ian worked. And then if you go into close up, you can see some of these big magnetic anomalies or high intensity readings in here. And this on the right, we have close-ups of them showing what these look like and showing that when we excavated these are ones we excavated, they all turned out to be significant cultural features. So all of these black marks here are significant cultural features, or at least the vast majority of them, as near as we can tell, at this site. Now, besides that way of looking at the site, we also, of course, did excavations, 2 full seasons of excavation in 2008 and 9. We returned in 2010 and dug one little area here to try and get a better idea of what solve a particular problem. And then we did some more limited excavations in the plowed field in 2012, basically testing magnetic anomalies in that particular area that we thought might be features, and it turns out they are. Now, the main excavated area is shown here from 2006 to 2010, including the tests. We excavated only 84 meters square, or about 0.44% of the total site, or 2.3% of the site that's at least partially buried, as near as I can tell. We found dense amounts of artifacts. That's why it took so long to excavate these, or we excavated a very small area despite the amount of time we spent on there. And also, there's a lot of artifacts to record and everything. And also, of course, we found lots of features. There were dense features in all of the units, 82 and 84 meters square. They range from the large, as I'll talk about more, a pit house at the top here, you can see that's about 5 meters across, to a whole range of smaller sized pits. These pits often occur, as I've shaded in the bottom in this one unit, in clusters of about the same size and shape, which suggests to me the pits had the same function in those clusters. And they're all together in one area, which suggests they were used in a short period of time. In other words, that each of these clusters represent what I would call, or what other people have called, an integrated series of events, where the people who actually dug them knew each other face to face as individuals, or they knew that they were dug by their father or their grandfather or grandmother or whatever on here. Although, as far as I know, we've seen this in late woodland sites, and people have often interpreted in this way, but as far as I know, nobody's ever tested that idea that they were integrated by, say, radiocarbon dating. Which brings me to the radiocarbon dating of the site. We had the one date that Ian Kenyon got years ago, and I've managed to obtain 56 AMS dates on the site from the nice funding I got from Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And I've worked with James Connolly, who's more of an expert on C14 dates and statistics than I am on this. But if you summarize all of these dates and plot them in what's called a kernel density model, you can see at the bottom here, this is from a paper we have coming out soon. You see that there's 2 peaks where there's basically 2 main periods of occupation. One of them about 2700 to 1700 BC, and one of them about 1500 to 900 BC. And these correspond exactly to our guesses of the general age range of Broadpoint and Smallpoint, so I'm sure they apply to that. There's no other way to explain this. What's also interesting is there's a bit of a gap in between, and in fact, the modeling suggests there may have been about a 250 to 350 year gap between the occupations. Whether that's characteristic of the site as a whole or only the small area we excavated, where almost all our dates are from, is another question. Now, even though we've got these two components and they clearly separate in the radiocarbon dates, some of the features don't. You can find dates, and you can see the ones I've squared and put in square boxes here. You get dates on this feature that are 800 years apart. Same here, same here, same here. The only cluster that in this particular block that you get dates that are consistent is this one here, and they're Broadpoint dates. Now, why is that? Well, the earliest component is the Broadpoint component. They dug and used these features, and everything in them is from that occupation. But when the Smallpoint people making Smallpoints came to the site, they dug these other ones, and what did they do? They dug through the earlier Broadpoint debris, including all sorts of features and things I'll talk about, and they incorporated older material. So the material in these features, these are Smallpoint features, but they have a lot of Broadpoint material in them. They're mixed up quite a bit on that. Nonetheless, if we look at these feature clusters, as I say, are these integrated series of events, we find that that one cluster just has Broadpoint dates, and they're statistically basically the same, which suggests they were used in a short period of time by certain individuals. And even in this one, if we ignore the older Broadpoint dates, we find that the three dates we got on this cluster of ones are virtually the same. And they're from two different labs, I think, those dates. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to look at the two components to give you an idea of what they're each like. Now, the Broadpoint component, as I mentioned, dates to about 2700 to 1700 BC. On the surface map, it's all the yellow and green dots. The yellow dots are Broadpoints or unfinished Broadpoints or finished ones, and the green dots are these Greywacke and other flakes. Now, what you find is that material of the Broadpoint is over the whole site. So the site is large, but the Broadpoint component itself covered a huge area, almost 2 hectares. On the southern half of the site, as I'll get to, it's about the only component other than one Smallpoint artifact, which is this red star down at the south end of it here on that. Jim Kieran, for his doctoral dissertation at Western, did a whole bunch of statistical analyses of the spatial distribution of material at this site. But the waste flakes on sub-Greywacke for the Broadpoint, what he found is when he plotted them, they formed several clusters, all of about the same size. And if you look at them closely, they all seem to have the same structure. They have a main density cluster with a small extension off the side of most of them on this, and they're fairly evenly spaced. I don't know how you explain that. The suggestion might be that they were all occupied at the same time to be that even spacing. I don't think each one represents a different occupation to get that spacing. I suppose it's possible. If that's the case, we know the site was used over a long period of time, so I'm sure there's more than one occupation on it. But if some of these are at least contemporary given the spacing, then this might be a site where different social units of some kind came together and aggregated at this site. That's one potential explanation for it. The artifacts include Genesee Broadpoints, as well as these 5-sided preforms. That these are roughouts that they rough out, and then they make them with a wider stem, and then when they go to want to use them, they make the actual stem in them. My former student, Caitlin Mallow, for her MA, did an analysis of these points. Some people have suggested these are so large that they were just used as knives. However, she found all sorts of fractures on them that suggest that they were used as spear tips for sure, as weapon tips. She carried out a number of experiments using replicas created by the master napper Dan Long for us, and firing these at dead animal targets and so on. And she found that they work very well as projectile tips. They would have been extremely lethal. And in fact, here's one that, just to see some other sorts of wear, was thrown and stuck in a tree here. So they work very well. The rest of the toolkit, though, is very enigmatic for Broadpoint. On the southern half of the site, it's the only component, as I mentioned, and yet there's almost no other stone tools. What you get is stem drills. These are points that have been reworked. The tips are missing of drills or perforators of some kind. And you get these kind of bifaces with these highly polished tips. Ian Kenyon noted them and thought they might be for hide working. They've been noted on Broadpoint sites since the 50s, as far away as Pennsylvania and so on. But there doesn't seem to be any other flake stone tools, which is quite unusual for any of the archaic groups that I know about. There are some rough stone tools. There's the odd net sinker, there's pitted stones and things like that as well. More importantly, I think, are the features from this site. There are hearths, obviously. Here's one with a burned fire damage point in place, as you can see at lower right here on it. There's also large pits, this large, which were expanding and with depth. They had a bell-shaped outline with a narrow top, and ethnographically, these were storage pits where people would store all sorts of excess foodstuffs for future use. They later, of course, when the foodstuffs were removed, got used as garbage dumps. So this pit actually had 4 broad points, a celt, a fish gorge, a deer bone, and a number of other things in it. And Steve Monkton, who's done all of our floral identifications, found a wide range of nutshell, oak acorn, cleavers, cattail, strawberry, and so on in this. What's important, I think, about this in-ground storage is, again, historic times. What we find is usually in-ground storage was used when sites were abandoned. That is, you only had to store in the ground if you were going to abandon the site for, going to other locations to find other resources and so on. And this way you protect them from various kinds of critters, both human and otherwise, breaking in and stealing the food in that. So the presence of these has sometimes been interpreted as indicating a site was abandoned in winter, and people could come back to the site in an emergency or in the spring when you have the low ebb in foodstuffs and you can rely on these stored foods at that time. So they have often been used as to indicate winter abandonment. There's also a large number of small to medium-sized pits. What these were used for is anybody's guess in many cases, because they just ended up as garbage dumps. They could have been dug initially, I suppose, to dispose of garbage, or they could have been latrines. Some of them could have been equipment caching. Ian Kenyon, in one of the features he excavated, found these 4 points, and although they're damaged, they could easily be repaired. And I never found anything like that in any of the points. So I think these were ones that somebody accumulated and left behind for future use, put them in a pit, and yet never used them. And of course, they could also be used for storage of other kinds of things here. And here's a cross section of one of them at lower left, what they're like. There's also, and these are very important, there are large debris dumps at this site, what I would call true middens. That is, areas that are set aside specifically for refuse disposal. This one and other ones at the site are in erosional channels that were here, and so these became filled up with refuse. This one is a Broadpoint midden or a gray layer. It's been intersected by a later Smallpoint pit house. You can see it here also, right? This area here, and it's fairly large. It fills this whole area at the upper right that I've marked in yellow here, but it extends farther to the west. How far? I assume to the river on that, filled with refuse. And this is important. On short occupied sites, you don't have to have specialized refuse disposal, but this indicates that they're staying there for quite a period of time, even though seasonally, apparently, they're staying there for several weeks or months, because that's when you need to do housekeeping. The other feature that's important here is one that Ian found, and this was what he referred to as a dog burial. It was badly preserved, and what he had was the upper and lower jaws and all of the teeth from this feature. Zoe Morris of Western, for her PhD in 2015, did isotopic analyses of a wide range of animal remains from sites, not only archaic sites, but wild canids, wild dogs and foxes, or wolves and so on. But also she did late woodland dogs from after 1000 AD, when people were eating maize, whereas at Davidson they weren't. And so this plot at the bottom right, it shows the amount of nitrogen on the left and increasing amounts of carbon on the right. And what you find is the late woodland dogs plot over here, because they're eating a lot of maize, or they're rooting in the garbage, and people were practicing maize. Whereas the Davidson, there's not that amount of carbon, because this is prior to the use of maize, basically. But also Davidson is different in higher nitrogen levels, suggesting a higher trophic level versus the wild foxes and wolves and so on. And why is that? Well, it's probably because they're eating a lot of fish. They're either being fed it by the archaic peoples who occupied the site, or alternatively, again, they're rooting, probably both, in the garbage and getting fish remains and so on in them. So that's very interesting. This is a pattern we've seen on archaic ones, notably at Jacobs Island, investigated by James Connolly. The dogs had a very similar pattern of nitrogen and carbon. So in the Broadpoint, it's used a long time. The floral remains, I won't go in detail, suggest primarily summer to fall use. And long seasonal occupation is indicated because you had that specialized refuse disposal. There's no evidence of structures. If they were there, they were fairly ephemeral, which also suggests to me it was used in the warmer weather. It was probably abandoned in winter, perhaps, given the use of in-ground storage. And it's very large, and the spatial organization might suggest that sometimes some of the occupations were aggregations of a number of different groups that came together at the site. Turning to the Smallpoint, it dates to about 1500 to 900 BC. Basically, the red stars are small points on the surface, and virtually all of them concentrate in this area along the old river course of the time. And you get all of the different small point site types of points here. It covers about 4,000 meters square, but it's very different than the Broadpoint in that it's just in the river area mainly, and intensively in that area. Now, the kinds of artifacts you get preforms, these little triangular preforms or unfinished ones for the points. You get points reworked into drills. You get end scrapers, you get serrated flakes, denticulates for cutting tools, notches for spoke shaves, bipolar pieces or wedges, and there's even birdstone and some drills at this site. A much more diverse toolkit than what we see in the Broadpoint component. Now, as I mentioned, the site, the dense artifacts are along the river here, and you see that corresponds exactly to the dense magnetic anomalies from the Gradiometer Survey. And what this suggests is that a lot of these features are really associated with the Smallpoint component, and that's borne out by the excavations that we did, that most of the features we found were of Smallpoint Archaic age. The features in the Smallpoint, there is also middens, once again, specialized refuse disposals in erosional channels. This particular one is 80 centimeters deep and full of refuse, and it's got some evidence of layering in it as well. It must have been used in at least 2 periods. And again, it suggests the residential stability at the site, staying there for a fairly lengthy period of time. It's not just a day or 2 stay. We also found a lot of small and medium-sized pits. Again, what the function of these is enigmatic. Some of them, however, like this cluster here of these large pits, I think they may have been earth ovens, although what they were baking in these ovens, I do not know. But you get a lot of firecrack rock lining and firecrack rock in them, plus some evidence of fire reddening soil underneath. So I think this is what they might be, but this needs a lot more work on it. There's also these pits with large posts underneath them. This one is like 40 centimeters deep, and it's about 20 centimeters across. This scale is 20 centimeters. So there were some huge posts here, and there's not a lot of other things associated. I don't know what they could possibly be, but they seem to have dug the pits down to help insert these large posts in the ground. Maybe they were marker poles of some kind. I just don't know, but I've never seen them reported on archaic sites before. Of course, the important things here are the Smallpoint structures, and particularly pit houses. There were 2 kinds of pit houses at this site that we found on this. These are some of the earliest houses that I know of, and because houses are rare in archaic sites and they've rarely been reported. One form of these houses is this example we excavated. It's 5 by 5 meters and about 1 meter deep. It has a keyhole shape because it has a sloping walking entrance going up to the ground level here, and then it's dug down into the ground on that. These are very distinctive, this particular house. It has a number of features of note. Around the sides at the back of the house, opposite the entrance, it has a bench cut in the wall. And you can see that in this profile. There's the drop down to the floor, and then here's the bench. There are obviously large support posts to support the roof underneath it. And then on this side, there's a post there, and then the slope is going right up, the sides slope up to the top. There's also, unfortunately, after the house was abandoned, and before I think the roof collapsed, water eroded into this, whether it was flooding or heavy rains, and it eroded the whole center area of the floor. Nonetheless, on one side of the floor, you can see here where this green is, and here it is at lower right. Coming down from the floor, there's a linear stain here, and I believe this was a partition that was put across the house to keep the back of the house sealed off and warmer, because pit houses are typically winter houses historically. To give you an idea what this house is like, and it always amazed me how much similar it is, I show at the top here a Northwest Coast pit house, courtesy of Dana Lipovsky from Simon Fraser, who allowed me to use this. This is a Northwest Coast house. It has a roof entrance, and it's quite large. The Davidson house differs in that respect, in that it has a ground entrance, and it's a bit smaller, but nonetheless, it has exactly the same kinds of features. You can see here a post at the bottom center, like the support posts inside. You can see the bench at the side here, and you can really see the bench versus the floor here, and over on this side where the bench is beginning. It had roof trusses, and you can see one of them here. Here's a close-up of it. It only had 4 of these roof trusses, 1 at each corner, as near as I can tell on this house on it. So they're extremely similar. And there's, of course, here's a pit feature dug down into the floor of the Davidson house as well. So they're quite the thing. The other kind of house is smaller, and here's an example of it here. It has a dug down entrance and center, and then it had a shelf area at the back at ground level on it. There was also a central pit, and this is a cross section of that pit you can see here. And essentially this was sod covered. It had a collapsed roof. In this profile at the upper left, at the bottom, you have the floor deposits where we got a radiocarbon date of perfect Smallpoint age from there. Then you have sterile sand. So when the house was abandoned, then rain washed in sterile sand, and then the roof collapsed on top. And that's what this upper deposit is. And I show a couple of posts. It's about 4 by 3 meters with the central pit. this particular house. Now, there's other houses at the site, but we only hit parts of them. At the top here, I show what I'm sure is the edge of another one of those large keyhole-shaped pit houses, and it's up here. You can see the anomaly. We just hit the edge of it in this excavation unit. Up here, here's the one pit house here, but you can see there's all sorts of very similar anomalies here. And if we extrapolate, we actually found parts of another one of this house in another unit of a similar form. If you extrapolate that from the area of the site with all of these anomalies and the number of anomalies, there could be as many as 100 houses here, which would be something that's unheard of for an archaic site, and certainly an estimate of over 4,000 other small point features, pits, and so on at the site. There was also a surface house that was outlined by a wall trench that had been dug. You can see it in red in the diagram at lower right to insert posts, and it has a gap on one side, which I've shown from two views, which was the entrance and two interior support posts on it. And here's the entrance to the second one of those small pit houses. And it's this house kind of house at Davidson, it turns out there are other houses like it from other sites. Here's a site from a site in Michigan. It's about 700 years older, but nonetheless, it's virtually identical to the Davidson house in terms of its structure. And I've seen what I think are similar ones on subsequent early woodland houses. There's a site in London that was dug by Timmins Martel Heritage Consultants that has a couple of things that I think are these houses. So the terminal archaic small point, basically, there is fish, turtle, pin cherry, and other things that you could take as evidence of warmer weather. But of course, some of these could be Broadpoint, because as I mentioned, they dug down these later pits through and incorporated a lot of older Broadpoint materials. So we don't know that. And of course, these things can be stored too. They may have been caught at different times or collected at different times of the year, but they could be stored for winter use and used then. I think the best seasonality evidence of all is the pit houses. These have good insulating properties, and certainly historically, they were used in the cold weather. They're winter use. The wall trench house, I don't know what it would be, although the Michigan example had a lot of flora and fauna suggest it was warmer weather. And if that's the case, in the terminal archaic, they could have been using two kinds of houses, one in winter use and one at other times of the year of warmer weather, but I don't know that. Certainly the site use is unprecedented, I think, for Ontario Late Archaic. Then you have multiple substantial houses, middens, and even though we don't know if all of these houses were used at the same time, I'm sure some of them were. I think you could see this as a real community or village. They don't match this stereotype of the mobile archaic peoples. And this does suggest that the middens, the effort that went into building these houses does certainly suggest increasing sedentism, or that people were less mobile in the late Archaic. There's also, of course, that it's very different use in the small point Archaic than in Broadpoint, in that it's concentrated along the river, that it seems to be in different seasons, the winter versus the warmer weather. They have a much broader toolkit that's stylistically different, and it might be separated in time from the earlier ones, although what you want to make of that is anybody's guess. So with that, I hope to have given you a nice overview of the work we did at the site. I have to thank all of these people. I'm not going to read out their names, who are the field workers, but especially Lindsay, Jim, and Nancy Van Sa, who are my assistant field directors, volunteers that we got through a program from the Ministry of Culture. Thank you to Sherry Prowse, as well as a large number of other volunteers that I've listed at the bottom here. I think I saw Dana Milson's name as being here, and I've got her there too. She helped us out at this site for sure. And with that, I've got just a few pictures of some of the other people working at the site, including your project director making field notes.